Welcome to the final lecture of this week. Hopefully you've gotten this done plenty ahead of time. Hopefully it's not 11 o'clock on Friday. If it is, well, at least you're getting it done. That's the important part. Today we're going to be talking about something that I think as Westerners we know almost nothing about. In fact, I would imagine, and this is not because you guys are ignorant or dumb in any way, you probably never even heard of it until my lecture on Iran, and that is the Iran-Iraq War, which occurred between 1980 and 1988. Why I think it's important to talk about this is because the Iran-Iraq War, in many ways, set up the modern landscape of the Middle East. And the reason it did that is because as a result of the Iran-Iraq War, the United States ended up with allies that it probably never anticipated it would have. It ended up with a destabilized Iraq that would require intervention not once, but twice, and the second time, effective occupation. And it would also lead Iran to be completely belligerent to the West. There was really this question about what Iran would do in 1980. Obviously, the Islamicists that took over were not exactly the West's favorites, but unfortunately, the actions between 1980 and 1988 pretty much assured that the Islamic groups in Iran would be hostile to the West. So it's a really important event, and I think it's worth talking about. And maybe it'll give you some context for the very, very difficult decisions that both George Herbert Walker Bush in 1988 to 1992 and George W. Bush 2000 to 2008 had to make, because these presidents are often criticized for their decision making, especially when it comes to their decisions to get involved in the Middle East. But they had some really tough decisions to make. They had some really tough decisions to make. They had a really complex geopolitical situation that really needs to be discussed and understood. So let's go back to 1980. Let's talk about the two sides and the major things we need to know about them. We've already talked about Iran, and we know where Iran was in 1980. They have just had an Islamic revolution in 1979. Remember that the Ayatollah Khomeini had taken over, and his Islamic Revolutionary Guard effectively controlled the entire nation. They were nationalizing all of the industry, so all of the money was coming back into the state, and they were radicalizing Iran. Now, let's go over to Iraq, the one that we don't know as much about. It might surprise you to know that Iraq was ruled for approximately 30 years by one guy who you're probably familiar with, and that is Saddam Hussein. If you don't know who Saddam Hussein is, I highly encourage you to go look up pictures of him on the internet or his Wikipedia page. Saddam Hussein is a pretty important figure for the last 30 years in the Middle East. Saddam Hussein had clawed his way to power in Iraq and had been doing several things. Iraq was kind of this pariah, this odd duck that was bouncing between the two superpowers at the time, the Soviet Union and the United States. It was buying its weaponry from the Soviet Union, but because of its oil connections, it actually was growing closer to the United States. And during the war, it would be backed partially by the United States, which is ironic. So it's kind of bouncing between the two sides. And obviously later on, the United States would invade Iraq. So obviously it's complex, to say the least. Now, Saddam Hussein and Iran had been butting heads for a number of years. And this had come to a head in 1975 when they'd signed a temporary peace agreement because there was border conflicts. And things seemed to be getting better in 1978 when the Iranians actually exposed a plot to oust Saddam Hussein, told him about it, and he swore friendship with the Shah of Iran. The problem is, in 1979, the Shah of Iran gets kicked out of power, and he is replaced by radical Shiite groups. And remember that map of Islamic territory. Where are all the Shiites? They're almost exclusively in Iran, but if you remember that map extremely well, and I think I'm going to post it in the supplementary material, so it might be available for you even now, you'll notice there's a big Shiite group in Iraq as well. This, along with economic considerations, are the two reasons for the war. What did Iraq want out of the war? Because Iraq starts the war. There's no question about who started the war. It was Iraq, undoubtedly. And there's two things that we can say about it. Number one, Saddam Hussein believed, and I mean, he has a pretty good reason for suspecting this, although he was wrong. He believed that Iran would be weak and it would be chaotic in Iran. And that makes sense. We just not only did we have a change in government, but we had a fundamentalist Islamic government show up. You can forgive Saddam Hussein for expecting there to be mass chaos because there was mass chaos. There was mass chaos. Unfortunately for Hussein, the mass chaos was primarily to the common people, not to the military establishment. So the war fighting part of Iran survived the conflict just fine. It was the average people that really suffered the most from the chaos. So unfortunately, that assumption was bad. The other reason that the war really started is Saddam Hussein is actually a Sunni, and the majority of people that lived in Iraq were Shiite. And the fear was that with Iran installing a Shiite government, by the way, first official Shiite government basically in existence, period. The fear was that the majority of Iraqis would throw off their government and they would try to join Iran, or they would become their own republic, Islamic Republic, as a Shiite republic. So Hussein had a problem. Number one, his own people, if he gave them long enough, might revolt. And I mean, Saddam Hussein wasn't that nice of a guy anyway, so it's possible that he would have gotten revolted against even had they not been basically a different religion. But in addition to this, the chaos in Iran seemed like it was giving him an opportunity, because by declaring war, he would pretty much prevent his own people from leaving, and he might be able to snap up some of the most valuable oil provinces in the entire world in 1980. So with all of that in mind, Saddam Hussein decided, I am going to attack. And he declares war, and he rolls his forces armed with Soviet weapons and tanks and planes into western Iran. Sorry, I got something in my eye here. You'd think wearing these glasses would protect me from this kind of thing. There we go. Okay. Whew, I can see again. So he rolls into Iran and begins attacking. Specifically, he's aiming for oil fields along the Tigris and Euphrates River. Had he successfully taken these, effectively, he would have cut Iran off from the Persian Gulf and turned Iran into a landlocked country. Suffice to say that that would have led to the economic destruction of Iran. So Iran's going to be pretty motivated to get this territory back, to say the least. Now, the interesting thing is, the conflict here really pits Soviet technology versus the United States technology, because remember that until 1979, who had Iran been allied with? They'd been allied with the United States. What kind of weapons had they been buying? They'd been buying F-14 Tomcats. They'd been buying M60 tanks. They'd been buying American small arms. So effectively, the Iranians, who the United States wanted to lose, had American technology. And the Iraqis, who the Americans wanted to win, had Soviet technology. So we've got Russian tanks and planes and guns on the Iraqi side, and we've got American tanks and planes and guns on the Iranian side, and they come together. Now, the complexity is this. The Iranians had a lot more tricks up their sleeve than Saddam Hussein expected. I mentioned in the Iran lecture that the Iranian Revolution is the birthplace to the radicalization of the Islamic military. And that is absolutely true in the Iran-Iraq war. Let me give you just a couple examples of the kind of attacks that they're going to use because of their devotion to their cause. Number one, we have suicide bombings. The Iranians were more than willing to send their guys with explosives strapped to them and blow up, basically terrorize Iraq, blow up military institutions, try and run across no man's land, dive into trenches and explode. They just had human bomb carriers. They were willing to do this. Again, there was some kind of eternal reward that made this worthwhile to them. Iran was also capable of massing what are oftentimes called human wave attacks. And really the only example of human wave attacks that you probably are familiar with is those of World War I. Imagine the mass groups of men running across no man's land in World War I, getting chewed up by machine guns. Iran was more than willing to do this. They would send thousands upon thousands upon thousands of men screaming across a field as thousands of them got gunned down by machine gun fire. But it didn't matter, because everyone who died in fighting would go to heaven effectively and have pleasures and delights, and they'd radicalized their young men so badly that they were willing to die basically at any cost. Obviously, this would be difficult for anyone to deal with. Certainly, this was difficult for Iraq, especially considering the fact that Iran had more than double, possibly as much as triple the population. And much of that population was armed in Iraq as opposed to Iran. So we have a very significant amount of human wave attacks, huge slaughters that immediately characterized the war. The Iran-Iraq War is oftentimes compared to World War I in the sense that it's going to devolve into trench lines, defensive fortifications. The reason for this, by the way, is because Iraq didn't have the kind of armor and airplane technology necessary to sustain the war, and Iran couldn't get replacements. And replacement parts is actually a much bigger deal than you might imagine. Those of you who like to work on cars, just imagine yourself in a situation where you are using a vehicle that is extremely hard on all of its parts, and you have no replacements, or the only replacements are those that you can make or salvage off other vehicles, perhaps vehicles that were destroyed, your own allies' vehicles. So think about a tank, for example. It's got thousands of gaskets. What happens when any one of those gaskets goes bad? Think about your own engine. How many gaskets can you lose before the engine's inoperable? Not many. The problem is that all of those parts are very specialty machines. There's no way for the Iranians to produce more. So they perhaps can buy things off the black market. They can perhaps salvage one from the tank that got blown up yesterday. There's options, but it's difficult. What does all of that mean? Why did I tell you all of that other than I like military history, which you probably had guessed already? Well, here's the important thing. Because of this, the Iraqis and the Iranians, after the first few years of the war, found themselves almost back at World War I level technology. They had more soldiers than they had armor. They didn't have planes to take air superiority. In fact, their air forces basically could only control their own space because they didn't have enough planes to lose in aerial dogfights. So what we end up with is a stalemate war, a war that moves very little after the first 2 years. After 1982, the Iraqis had been pushed out of Iran. The Iranians invaded Iraq, but then got pushed back out. And we just have kind of a stalemate on the original borders, and things are stuck. The war goes on for 8 years, lasts from 1980 to 1988. Politically and economically devastating for both nations, leads to a lot of deaths from starvation and famine. But it's really the end of the war that brought the war to national, or international, I should say, attention, because it became increasingly clear that Saddam Hussein was turning to desperate weapons to try and bring the Iranians to the negotiating table. Number one, the Iran-Iraq War was the first major war that saw extensive use of missiles, guided missiles, specifically ground-based guided missiles. Iraq used missiles that are sometimes referred to as SCUDs. They basically stand for surface weapons, basically. And what you would do is you would take the launchers and you would set them up and you would fire them, and the missiles would be programmed generally to hit a specific area, not very precisely because the computer technology and the tracking technology was poor, but they could certainly hit a city. If you told it to go hit that city 100 miles away, it could do that, certainly. It couldn't hit a specific place like modern missiles can, but still. But effectively, what the two sides started doing is they started bombing each other. The problem with these missiles is that, again, the technology wasn't really there to create missiles that could take out hardened military targets, meaning that these missiles weren't often used on enemy bunkers. They just couldn't do anything. They'd explode and the guys inside would be fine. Instead, they began to be used increasingly on civilian populations. They began falling out of the sky on civilians in the middle of the night, exploding and blowing them up and doing excessive amounts of damage to the civilian populations. And obviously, most nations were not comfortable with this. Even if most people wanted to see Iran lose the war, they didn't want to see Iraq win the war at the expense of innocent people. Another thing that Iraq began doing is they began using nerve gas. If you're not familiar with what nerve gas is, it's a number of compounds that basically, when it interacts with your system, it makes your nerves basically send transmissions to your brain. It travels along your nervous system, and when it does that, it can get into your brain extremely quickly. When it does that, it can actually literally shut down your brain. It's nasty. Certain nerve toxins work differently. If you feel like you need to know more about nerve toxins, please look them up on the internet. They are very interesting and incredibly deadly. And unfortunately, Iraq decided it was going to start using them, along with other more unconventional different kinds of gas attacks, including mustard gas and chlorine, which we saw all the way back in World War I and literally hadn't seen since. Effectively, what Iraq did is it threw out the Geneva Convention and started using weapons of terror, again, primarily on civilian populations. The nerve gas was used on military targets, but the chlorine and the mustard gas, which effectively can't do anything if you're prepared for it, was dropped on civilian populations to attempt to enforce some kind of ceasefire. Now, the event that really ended popular support for the Iraqi government was when the gas attacks were proven not only to be occurring on the Iranians, but they were also occurring on native population. And so Saddam Hussein had tried to be really sneaky here. When he started using gas attacks, he claimed that the Iranians had started to use them first. And his evidence for this were several villages in northern Iraq that had been clearly attacked by gas weapons. It was clear. And public opinion in the world was strongly against Iran. They thought Iran was really gassing people. And, Saddam Hussein responding to this wasn't so bad. Until finally it came out that actually the Iraqis had launched the missiles on these villages. They had gassed their own people. Who were these people? They were the Kurds, people I mentioned on Monday or on the first lecture, as not really having their own homeland. Probably should, but because of how the borders were divided up in World War I, they didn't have their own land. Well, Saddam Hussein had decided that this was a perfect opportunity to get rid of those guys and at the same time pin Iran with gas attacks. And so when this finally came out, about 3 months after the gas attacks had started, it became clear that Saddam Hussein had not only attacked Iran with gas weapons unprovoked, but he was gassing his own people. Public opinion in the world completely turned against him. And with that being said, he was forced to ask the UN to negotiate peace terms. And eventually, in 1888, Iran agreed because their economy was collapsing. One other thing I want to talk about before we talk about the after effects, and there are some serious after effects of this war, we'll get to those, is I want to talk about the Iran-Contra affair. This is a controversy and a mistake by the United States government that is quite famous. And again, I encourage you to look it up. It is quite complex, however, so maybe look up a documentary or a YouTube video about it. Don't try and read about it at Wikipedia. It's confusing to say the least. The Iran-Contra affair is generally, at least from a very, very far up overview, the program where the United States was attempting to topple a Nicaraguan political leader, and the CIA was not approved to do that. So what the CIA did is basically they had some guys that kind of branched off and they started taking weapons and selling them to the Iranians, which they could do. And they took the profits from selling those weapons and then they funneled that into the Nicaraguan rebels. And basically this was all occurring off the books. There was some money disappearing. There were weapons and things disappearing and nobody knew where they were going. And then there was these guys basically being backed by the Americans and nobody knew how they were being backed and there wasn't anything in the budgets. And eventually some guys went to prison and this became a huge controversy in the Reagan administration. Ronald Reagan claimed not to know any of that was going on, nor that was even possible. And by the way, Ronald Reagan, for all of his pithy quotes and his jovial leadership, was not a career politician. He probably didn't know, but certainly some people in his administration did that definitely didn't get in trouble for it. So there's this big controversy. And obviously that created some ill will with Iraq when it came out that the United States, despite saying Iraq, hey, we support you until you gassed people, but we're also funding Iran. So it kind of looked like the United States was paying both sides to kill each other. Obviously, that doesn't do a lot of good for the United States' reputation in the Middle East. Looks like you're backing both sides, killing each other. Looks like you hate brown people. That's basically the final response to that situation. Clearly, there's a problem there. Now, let's talk about the after effects of the war. 1988 rolls around. Saddam Hussein is politically very damaged. Number one, he's being cut off from the West for his gassing of his own people, as you might be able to expect. Iran has been isolated, but nothing's changed there. So Iran kind of goes about its business. But Iraq is in a very difficult situation. Number one, it had bought huge amounts of Soviet technology in 1987. The Soviet Union was going down, and effectively it was having a flash sale. Okay, if you've ever gone to the store and gotten a whole bunch of things on sale, the Soviet Union was doing that, except for things like tanks. So Saddam Hussein had gone nuts in 1987, and he had bought tons and tons and tons of military equipment. The problem is the war's over. What do you do with that equipment? It just showed up. You had to pay for it all. How do you pay for that? He didn't have the budget to do it. He was expecting to win huge provinces and concessions from Iran that never materialized. This put Saddam Hussein in a situation where he very strongly felt that he needed to use this technology to have some kind of gain. And okay, Iran was too big to pick on, but there's another nation nearby with lots of oil wealth that I can pick on and get some of my money back out of this, and that was Kuwait. And in 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait with the weapons that they had bought from the Soviet Union during the Iran-Iraq War. Now, Kuwait was an ally of the United States, and in fact, the United States warned Iraq, if you go there, we will come and drive you out. And that's exactly what happens. In 1990 and 1991, we have the Persian Gulf War, sometimes called Desert Shield, where our forces went in and they drove the Iraqis back out of Kuwait and actually drove all the way to Baghdad, where Saddam Hussein surrendered effectively, although he stayed in power. Saddam Hussein stayed in power until 2003, and when we invaded his nation, eventually he was killed. But the Kuwaiti storming is one of the most famous events, I think, in modern history. And if you've never seen the videos of the oil fields burning as the Iraqis pulled out, I highly encourage you to look up some photo stills. It's really quite a haunting image. Because when the Iraqis realized the United States and their allies were coming in force and going to drive them out, the Iraqis decided they were going to destroy as much as possible. So they lit oil wells on fire on their way out as they pulled out to deny them to the Americans effectively is what they were doing. And so really quite an interesting event. And that war comes immediately out of the Iran-Iraq War. If the Iran-Iraq War didn't happen, Desert Shield doesn't happen in 1990, 1991. Saddam Hussein doesn't get humiliated in 1991. We might not have 2003. We don't have 2003. We might not be involved in the Middle East at this time. We might have been able to focus more resources on Afghanistan or been out. So this is like a domino effect. This one war, in many ways, is the reason that we're still in the Middle East right at this time. So it's very complex, and it's definitely something that we as Westerners don't talk about very much. That's all I have for you guys today. Remember that there is a worksheet that goes with this lecture just to make sure that you're paying attention and you're answering those questions. So please don't neglect to do that. Remember that everything needs to be in by Friday at midnight if possible. Again, if you need an extension for some reason, like you've got the coronavirus or something, please just shoot me an email and we can work that out. Hopefully you guys have had a great week. I will see you on the next week.